Around noon on January 13th, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses was sitting in her office at the University of Texas at Dallas when she heard her cell phone ding inside of her purse. Anna knew she was not supposed to use her cell phone during work, but she had a feeling she'd just gotten a text from someone very special. So Anna kind of discreetly slid her phone out of her purse, and when she looked at the screen, she smiled. Like she'd thought, her boyfriend, Michael Stodnick, had texted her to confirm that they were still on for dinner that night. Just looking at this message gave Anna butterflies. Michael was a business professor at the university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had seriously dated since her divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been an item now for the last 6 months, but for Anna, who'd previously been married for 15 years, dating still felt very new. She and Michael were both single parents in their early 40s, but this new relationship made Anna feel young again. Anna quickly texted Michael to let him know she was definitely still on for dinner, then she quietly slid her phone back into her purse and got back to work. Anna was the assistant director of strategic planning and analysis at UT Dallas, but that was not her only job. She was also a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in data analytics, so Anna was very busy. But as soon as the clock hit 2 p.m., Anna stood up from her desk and headed upstairs. She knocked on an office door before opening it, but really the knocking was just a formality. The person sitting at the desk inside, University Vice Provost John Warkowski, always expected Anna for afternoon tea. When Anna walked in, the 71-year-old administrator greeted her with a smile and called her by a special nickname, Babochka. It meant butterfly in Russian, and hearing it made Anna feel nostalgic for the country where she grew up. Anna sat down across from Dr. Warkowski, and right away he handed her a steaming cup of tea. Dr. Warkowski had wild gray hair, big glasses, and he always smelled like cigarettes. Anna was not particularly fond of the smell in his office, but she still felt very comfortable with him because over the past 2 years, she'd spent hours in this office confiding to him about her personal life. Dr. Warkowski knew things about Anna that most people simply didn't, like that she'd immigrated to the United States in 1998 just to marry her now ex-husband, Bob Moses. He and Anna had met in Russia when Bob was visiting as a tourist. Then they kept in touch through email for months until he finally asked her to marry him. Bob had been Anna's anchor in America, which made their divorce that much more painful for her. Anna and her ex, Bob, were still on very friendly terms, but at this point, Dr. Warkowski had really taken over the role of being Anna's rock now. That day, Anna and Dr. Warkowski's conversation centered around Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was a student right there at UT Dallas. Anna said she was worried that she and her son might be growing apart. The previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his dorm to her home in Frisco, Texas, as he usually did, but Igor had seemed quiet and distant all weekend. It made Anna worry that he had some problem that he didn't want to talk about. Dr. Warkowski sipped his tea, then told Anna she was a great mother and not to worry. Sometimes children, especially adult children, just need some space. He assured her that whatever was going on with him, Igor would eventually tell her when he was ready. Anna sighed and said, you're probably right. Then she finished her tea, gave the doctor a hug, and headed back downstairs to her office. A couple hours later, at around 5 p.m., Anna turned off her computer and grabbed her purse. It was cold outside, in the 30s, so near freezing, so Anna put on her coat and 2 scarves before waving goodbye to her coworkers and walking outside to the parking garage. She got inside of her blue Hyundai sedan and then headed into rush hour traffic. Part of the way home, Anna's stomach began to growl. She was hungry. Anna looked at the clock and saw that it was 5:30, which meant her boyfriend Michael would not be picking her up for dinner for another 2 hours. So she decided to pull off the highway right then and go to a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell that served Mexican food, and she went through the drive-thru and she bought a chicken quesadilla. Anna was really hungry, but after receiving the food, she didn't eat it in the car. Instead, she just set it on her passenger seat. Anna generally preferred to keep her surroundings really tidy, and so she never ate in her car. It was just too messy. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned into her neighborhood. As she approached her 2-story brick house, she stopped beside her mailbox and rolled the window down to grab her mail. Then she pulled her Hyundai into the garage. Anna shut the garage door behind her, she gathered up her purse, her mail, and her quesadilla, and she got out of the car. She walked towards the door that led into her home, thinking about how excited she was for her date that night with Michael. But as she reached for the doorknob, Anna heard the sound of rustling behind her, followed by a loud clap. Just after 7:30 p.m. on the same day, Michael pulled up to Anna's house, and he noticed all the lights were off, as if Anna was not home. Michael was confused, but he got out of his car and knocked on Anna's front door. When she didn't answer, he called her, but she didn't pick up. Michael thought about going inside. Anna had actually recently given him a house key, but he knew Anna always turned on her alarm system when she left the house, and he didn't know the code to disable it, and he didn't want to set it off and cause a scene in such a quiet neighborhood. Michael began to feel cold just standing outside, so he turned around, went back to his car, and tried calling Anna again. But Anna's phone again went to voicemail. Anna had never missed a date with Michael before, but Michael told himself, Anna was very busy, she was a grad student and a mother, she could have easily gotten sidetracked with any number of things. So even though he was very disappointed, Michael decided to go home and wait for Anna to call him back. He was sure she would explain everything as soon as she could. The next morning at 9 a.m., Michael once again pulled into Anna's driveway. He had continued calling and texting her until 11 p.m. the previous night, but she never responded. Michael even contacted Anna's friends to ask about her, but they too had not heard from her. And so when Michael woke up on this morning with no text or no calls from Anna, the first thing he did was drive to her house. Michael knocked on the front door, and when there was no response, instead of going in, he instead called the Frisco Police Department. He told the dispatcher that he hadn't heard from his girlfriend since the previous afternoon when she was working at UT Dallas, and now he was at her house knocking on her door and she wasn't answering phone calls or text messages, and so he asked if somebody could come out to her house to make sure she was okay. The dispatcher was obviously empathetic, but they told Michael that for this type of thing, protocol was he would need to call the university's campus police first, and then if for some reason they couldn't handle it, then they would ratchet this up to the Frisco Police Department. And so Michael hung up and then looked up the number for the university campus police and called them, and they promised him they would look into the situation right away. Michael thanked them and hung up, and even though he still felt very uneasy about this, he had to get to work. So he got into his car and drove away. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Ream received a call from the University of Texas Dallas campus police. They told Sergeant Ream they were looking for a university employee named Anna Moses. Her boyfriend had just called to request a welfare check, and the campus police had quickly learned that Anna did not show up for work that day, which her coworkers said was highly unusual. Because Anna was not actually living on campus, the university officer asked Ream if he could go check her home in Frisco. Ream said he was on it, and a few minutes later he was out the door, headed towards Anna's address. Ream got there at 10:50 a.m. and knocked on the door. When nobody answered, Sergeant Ream tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Ream knew he could knock down Anna's door, but that seemed extreme. Instead, he called the campus police back and asked if they knew anyone who could let him inside. Over an hour later, at 12:05 p.m., 2 cars pulled up outside of Anna's house. A campus police officer stepped out of one, and Anna's son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had been able to find Igor on campus, and he told them he had a key and knew the alarm code to his mother's house. Igor nodded curtly at Sergeant Ream, then unlocked his mother's front door and walked inside and disabled the alarm. As Ream entered Anna's home, Igor walked past him and back outside. He did not seem concerned at all about his mother. He just said he'd be out in the car waiting for whenever they were done. Sergeant Ream thought Igor's behavior was strange, but he couldn't worry about that right now. Instead, he and the university police officer walked into Anna's foyer. The house was totally silent except for the officer's footsteps on the tile. They searched the first floor, but they didn't find any sign of Anna, and they were about to head upstairs when the sergeant remembered they should scope out the garage. Ream made his way to the door that led to the garage, and he opened it. And right away, even in the darkness, he could tell Anna's car was not parked inside, making the garage feel very empty. Then he flipped on the overhead light, and he gasped. Anna was lying on her back on the garage floor with blood coming out of her mouth, and there were bullet casings all around her. It was obvious just from looking at her that she was deceased. The university officer came over and looked into the garage too, and instantly brought a hand up to his mouth in shock. Neither of the officers had ever seen anything like this before. Frisco was an extremely safe community with very few violent crimes. It actually had been called one of the safest cities in the entire United States. But that only made Anna's apparent murder that much more shocking. Her quiet suburban home was now a crime scene. Even though he rarely worked homicide cases, Sergeant Ream knew the protocol. First, he and the university officer backed out of the garage and closed the door so they would not disturb any evidence. Then they checked the rest of Anna's home to make sure nobody else was there. Once they confirmed the house was empty, Reem called the Frisco Police Department for assistance. Reem then slowly walked outside towards Igor's car parked by the curb. As he got closer, Igor rolled down the window and looked at the sergeant without saying anything. Once he reached the car, Reem took a deep breath and told Igor that he had terrible news. His mother was dead, and it looked like she'd been murdered. The sergeant watched Igor for a reaction, but the young man's face was blank. Then Igor just furrowed his eyebrows and asked if his mother was in one piece. Sergeant Reem was so surprised by this question that he just said, "Well, yeah." Igor nodded and then said he had to go because he had class. Reem had no idea what to make of Igor's very bizarre reaction. It was so odd, but Igor had just received this life-shattering news, and Reem knew, shock can make people behave in totally inexplicable ways. So for now, Reem decided to give Igor a pass, and he just figured, they would do everything they could to find out what happened to his mother. Then the sergeant heard a siren blaring, and he looked up to see a Frisco PD cruiser heading his way. A few minutes later, Frisco detective Brian Schutte and Texas Ranger Ruben Mankin stood inside of Anna's garage. The two men were from different agencies, but they'd both been assigned to lead the case together. The crime scene made Schutte feel totally sick. He was a very young detective, and this wasn't just the first time he'd be leading a murder investigation. This was his first murder case that he'd ever worked on. Detective Schutte squatted next to Anna's body. She was still wearing a heavy coat and two scarves, but he could see a bullet wound in her neck. And scattered on the floor around her were a few unopened envelopes, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and a black purse. There were also a handful of bullet casings, which the detective identified as coming from a .22 caliber gun. Detective Schutte told Mankin that it seemed like Anna had been outside, which is why she was wearing warm clothes, and she had come in and was carrying her mail, purse, and fast food trash when somebody shot her in her garage. Schutte figured that Anna had likely been killed the previous evening when she came home from work. Ranger Mankin nodded in agreement, but he pointed out that Anna's car wasn't parked in the driveway or the garage, so he wondered if her killer had stolen it. Maybe Anna had been killed during a robbery. But then Detective Schutte opened up Anna's black purse, and it didn't seem like anybody had rifled through it. And Anna's wallet, which contained $300 in cash, was still inside her purse. And the inside of Anna's house also looked totally undisturbed. So if this was a robbery, the only thing the killer stole was Anna's car, which didn't really make any sense. Schutte told Mankin that he really wasn't sure about the robbery theory, it felt kind of weak, but the missing car did give them a good place to start. So Schutte radioed the Frisco Police Department and asked a fellow officer to put out a bulletin about Anna's stolen vehicle. But at the same time, Schutte was thinking to himself that it seemed most likely that Anna had been killed by somebody she knew. After all, the killer had clearly gained access to the garage without breaking in, and the young detective couldn't stop thinking about the very strange statements and behavior of Anna's son, which the local police had briefed him about. Schutte really wanted to interview Igor as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Detective Schutte sat down across from Igor inside of an interview room at the Frisco police station. Igor looked remarkably calm, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. The detective asked Igor to please talk about his relationship with his mother. Igor said that he and his mother had always been very close. They both loved music, and when Igor joined a Christian rock band as a teenager, his mom supported him and came to almost all of his shows. Even now that Igor was living on his own at college, he still went home to visit her every weekend. Anna kind of babied him by doing his laundry and cooking for him, but Igor kind of liked it. But he said seeing Anna divorce his dad had been really difficult. Bob actually was not Igor's biological father. He had adopted him. And so for Igor, he looked at Bob as his father. That was his dad. And when Igor said that, Schutte stopped him because he hadn't realized Bob was not his biological father. But Igor explained that his mother had actually been married twice, once briefly to a man in Russia and then to Bob in the United States. The Russian man was Igor's biological father, but Bob had legally adopted Igor when he was just 4 years old. And as Igor talked about his dad, Bob, he became emotional. Igor said he, personally, Igor, had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer when he was just 8 years old, and his dad had always been there to support him. Igor's cancer eventually went into remission, but the experience showed Igor that Bob genuinely loved him like he was his own son. Detective Schutte couldn't help but feel moved by Igor's story, but he wanted to stay focused on the horrible crime he was still investigating. So he asked Igor if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother. Igor thought for a moment and then said no. But he added, whoever killed his mother should be forgiven. Igor said he was a devout Christian and he believed all people, even killers, should be treated with mercy. Schutte was shocked. Igor did not seem to care at all that his mother was horribly murdered, but the detective just stared at the college student trying to remain professional and followed up by asking Igor where he'd been the previous evening. Igor said he had been in class from around 5:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., and he had classmates who could vouch for him. Schutte did not have any evidence that would allow him to hold Igor any longer, though he still felt very suspicious of him. But despite Schutte's inexperience as a detective, he still knew the worst thing an investigator could do right now was get tunnel vision about one suspect. For now, he knew he needed to explore every possibility, and he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to next: Anna's ex-husband and Igor's dad, Bob. After Schutte told Igor he was free to go, the detective went to his office and he saw Ranger Mankin had left him a note about the progress in his investigation and that the medical examiner had sent a copy of Anna's autopsy report over. Mankin's note explained that he'd been able to reconstruct Anna's last day by obtaining security camera footage from UT Dallas, local toll roads, a Taco Bell, and also an elementary school near Anna's house. After reviewing this footage, Mankin estimated that Anna got home from work between 5:50 and 5:55 p.m. on January 13th, and based on the crime scene, he felt certain she was killed almost immediately when she went inside. Next, Schutte looked over the autopsy report that was sent over, which largely supported Mankin's theory about when Anna was killed. The medical examiner said Anna had been shot at close range 6 times. All of the bullets came from the same .22 caliber gun, and the wounds were grouped tightly together, which made the medical examiner think her killer had some level of experience using firearms. But there was one odd detail that really stood out to the medical examiner. The detectives had told him before he did the autopsy that Anna had bought a quesadilla at around 5:30 p.m., which would be less than half an hour before she was killed. And considering they found the empty wrapper for this quesadilla next to her dead body, it suggested she had eaten it. However, when the medical examiner examined Anna's stomach contents, it looked like she hadn't eaten for many hours prior to her death. And if Anna didn't eat that quesadilla, well, according to the medical examiner, it seemed highly plausible that her killer did. Schutte was so disturbed by the idea of somebody who could shoot someone in cold blood 6 times, kill them right in their house, and then pick up their Taco Bell and eat it over their body. It just seems so unbelievably psychotic. And so Schutte called Ranger Mankin and said he knew it was late, but they did not have time to waste. They really needed to dig in right now. So, shortly before midnight on Wednesday, January 14th, Schutte and Mankin knocked on the door of a medium-sized home in Frisco. This is where Bob had been living since his and Anna's divorce. He was renting a room and sharing the home with 3 other men. Bob answered the door. He was wearing pajamas and looked confused to see the police. He asked if everything was okay, and Detective Schutte just said no. They needed to speak with him about his ex-wife, but it would be better if they talked at the police station. But Bob didn't move right away. Instead, he stayed in his doorway and just kept asking, really, what's happening here? Can you tell me anything else? And finally, Detective Schutte said, "I'm sorry, but unfortunately, your ex-wife is dead." As soon as he said it, Bob's face just fell, and he agreed to go with them to the station. Bob's interview began at 1 a.m., so it was now Thursday, January 15th. And it wasn't until Schutte, Mankin, and Bob were actually sitting in the interview room that they told Bob Anna was not just dead, she had been murdered. Bob looked horrified, and his first question was, "Is Igor okay?" The police assured Bob that Igor was fine. Then Ranger Mankin asked Bob where he'd been on the evening of January 13th, the night that Anna was killed. Bob said he'd been home watching TV till about 7 p.m., and then he went out for dinner, and he said his 3 housemates could easily confirm his story. Bob admitted he owned 5 guns, 3 of which were .22 caliber, and he agreed to hand them all over to police for ballistics analysis. And when detectives asked him for a DNA sample, he gave them a swab without any hesitation. Ranger Mankin thanked Bob for his cooperation and told him he was free to go. After Bob was gone, both Mencken and Schutte agreed that Bob did seem honest and seemed genuinely distressed at his ex-wife's death, but they still needed to follow up on his alibi. However, it was super late, nearly 2 a.m., and so Schutte and Mencken decided to call it a day. But just then, Schutte's phone rang. A Frisco Police Department patrol officer told him that they had just found Anna's stolen car in a residential neighborhood a few blocks away from her house, and the patrol officer was pretty sure they could see blood inside. Schutte's heart started to race. He told the patrol officer to make sure nobody touched that car. In the meantime, he would arrange for a tow truck to bring the vehicle to the crime lab for analysis. After a few hours of sleep, Schutte arrived at the Frisco Police Department crime lab early on Thursday morning. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was there, and a technician was waiting to brief the detective on what they'd found. The technician said the vehicle was remarkably clean inside, except for a few things. There was an empty Red Bull energy can, there was a cigarette butt, and there were 2 small bloodstains, one on the right side of the driver's seat and one on the center console. Schutte was really excited at this news, and so he had the can, cigarette, and swabs of the blood sent off for DNA testing, along with the swab that Bob had given them during his interview. But Schutte knew it could take weeks to get these results back, so for now, he still had to continue with old-fashioned detective work. The most obvious person to interview next was Anna's boyfriend, Michael. He agreed to come in for an interview, and soon Schutte was sitting across from the business professor at the police station. Michael leaned forward and ran his hands through his short brown hair. He looked anxious, and before Schutte even began the interview, Michael asked if he should have a lawyer. The detective promised him this was all totally routine. Michael picked at his fingernails as he told Schutte that he and Anna had not been dating for very long, but their relationship had been moving in a good direction. He said a few days ago, on January 13th, he'd gone to Anna's house to pick her up just after 7:30, and he'd been confused by her absence. And now he was horrified to know Anna had been lying dead in her garage the entire time he was there. Once Michael began talking, he started to open up a bit more, but as soon as Schutte asked him for a DNA sample, he clammed up. Then he asked again about maybe getting a lawyer. The detective said that really wasn't necessary, but he would give Michael some time alone to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. Schutte left, but what Michael didn't know was that the detective could still see and hear Michael through a camera in the corner of the room. So Schutte watched as Michael began mumbling to himself. The detective could not make out all the words, but at one point, Michael asked himself, "Am I overreacting?" A few minutes later, the detectives went back in and asked Michael if he had made a decision. Michael said yes. He said he would give a sample of his DNA. Schutte smiled, and then he got the swab from Michael and told him he was free to go. Then Schutte sent this newest DNA sample to be tested against the other items from Anna's car. While they waited for the DNA results, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mencken interviewed some of Anna's friends and co-workers. And quickly, the investigators soon learned that Bob and Michael were not the only men in Anna's life. Anna's friends pointed detectives towards a man named Jerry Caspel, a poet who they said had a deep spiritual bond with Anna. Her co-workers also mentioned a vice provost at UT Dallas named Dr. John Workowski, who seemed to be Anna's mentor. Detective Schutte contacted Jerry first, and when he arrived for his interview, he was totally overwrought and on the brink of tears. He told the detective that Anna was his muse, and without her, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to write poetry again. Schutte narrowed his eyes at Jerry's very melodramatic display, but he let him keep talking. Jerry explained that he met Anna at a public speaking course a few years back, and they'd bonded over their love of art. They often went to the opera together, and Anna would read and edit Jerry's poems. He'd published 2 books of poetry and dedicated them both to her. Schutte thought this connection sounded very intense, so he asked Jerry what Anna's boyfriend thought about them being so close, and Jerry looked surprised. He said he didn't even know Anna had a boyfriend. But regardless, he insisted their relationship was not romantic, it was purely spiritual. The detective found the whole tale pretty hard to believe. He asked Jerry if he owned any firearms, and Jerry said yes, he had a .22 caliber handgun. But he quickly agreed to let the police analyze it, and he also gave them a DNA sample. Next, Schutte asked where Jerry was around 6 p.m. on January 13th. Jerry said he was driving home from work on a Dallas toll road that was very far away from Anna's home, and the toll records would certainly reflect that. Schutte thanked Jerry, and as soon as the poet left, Schutte just shook his head. It did not seem like Jerry was a viable suspect. So he called the next man on his list. A few days later, Detective Schutte began to interview Dr. John Warkowski. The university administrator explained that he met Anna through work, and they grew very close during her divorce. Then, Dr. Warkowski said something surprising. He told the detective that he and Anna once had an affair. Schutte stared at the man, who was 70 years old, making him 27 years older than Anna. Dr. Warkowski said he knew that he and Anna seemed like an unlikely pair, but it really was true. He said Anna wanted to have a relationship with him, and he had to cut it off because of their age difference. It just seemed totally inappropriate. But they still remained close friends, and so Dr. Warkowski knew very intimate details about her life, like how she struggled emotionally and financially after her divorce. Dr. Warkowski said he considered it his privilege to help Anna with money. In fact, in the 2 years since her divorce, he'd wired her a total of $46,000 US. Dr. Warkowski insisted this money was given as a gift with no strings attached, but Schutte was not convinced. He wondered if maybe, during one of their intimate conversations, Anna had learned something about the administrator that he wanted to keep hidden. What if those gifts were actually hush money payments? Or maybe he was paying Anna for sex, and she was threatening to expose him. Thinking about the items found in Anna's car, Schutte asked Dr. Warkowski if he drank energy drinks or smoked cigarettes. Dr. Warkowski said he didn't like energy drinks, but he definitely smoked. And when the detective asked for his whereabouts on the evening of January 13th, the administrator said the same thing Jerry did. He was driving home from work on a toll road that was far away from Anna's home, and certainly the records would reflect that. Schutte made a note of this, but unlike Jerry, he didn't think this let Dr. Warkowski off the hook. So Schutte asked the administrator if he'd be willing to give a voluntary DNA sample. Dr. Warkowski said he was happy to do anything that would help the police solve this case. So he let the detective swab the inside of his cheek before he left the police station. At this point, Detective Schutte felt like he had 5 strong suspects: Anna's son Igor, her ex-husband Bob, and her boyfriend Michael, plus the poet Jerry, and the university administrator Dr. John Warkowski. They all claimed to have alibis, however, none of them had been corroborated yet. Detective Schutte briefed Mencken on everything he discovered about these suspects, and Mencken agreed that they couldn't rule any of them out quite yet. Shortly after that, the detectives got disappointing news from the ballistics analysis on Bob and Jerry's guns. None of the guns matched the one that killed Anna, so they still didn't have the murder weapon. Schutte sighed. Until he got the DNA results and Mencken finished investigating their suspects' alibis, he had no other leads to pursue. But Detective Schutte didn't want to just sit around waiting for other investigators to do their work, so he started wondering if maybe he should go back to Anna's house and have another look around. Police had done an initial search, but there was always a chance something got missed. So Schutte obtained a search warrant, and in late January, about 2 weeks after Anna's murder, he returned to her home. When he got there, he saw there were 2 cars parked outside. So he went up to the door and knocked, and was surprised when Anna's ex-husband, Bob, answered the door. Igor was standing just a few feet behind him. It turned out the father and son had moved into Anna's home a couple weeks ago, 1 day after her body was found in the garage. This struck the detective as a very strange thing to do, but Bob quickly explained that he and his son were grieving together. And because Igor lived in a college dorm and Bob lived in a house with 3 other men, Anna's home was the only private place they could go to. Schutte said that did make sense. However, even though they wanted private time, he held up a search warrant and said he needed to come inside. So Bob immediately opened the door wide and said, "Come on in." The first thing Schutte did is he went into Anna's home office. There, he dug through her desk drawers until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a copy of Anna's life insurance policy. Anna had taken out a policy worth $750,000 US, and she had named one person as the sole beneficiary, her son, Igor. Suddenly, it looked like Igor, whose behavior had struck investigators as very odd from the onset, stood to gain a lot from his mother's death. Then Schutte managed to jimmy open a locked drawer in her desk, and he found something even more interesting. It was a handwritten letter, mostly in Russian. He couldn't understand what it said because he didn't speak Russian, but he figured it must contain something very private since Anna had kept it in a locked drawer. Schutte quietly slid the letter into an envelope and then left the desk and finished searching the rest of the house. He didn't find anything else in the house of note, and so after he left and got back to the police station, he sent a copy of that letter to the FBI so an agent who spoke Russian could translate it for him. In early February, Detective Schutte received a translation of that letter from Anna's desk, and suddenly, Anna's murder started to make a lot more sense. Anna had written this letter herself about one of the police's suspects, and it cast her connection to this man into a totally new light. Next, Ranger Mankin reported back that he had checked out all 5 men's alibis, and he'd been able to verify all of their stories except for one of them. The person whose alibi could not be confirmed was also the same person Anna had written about in her letter. And finally, Schutte got the results of the DNA analysis. DNA from the Red Bull can and cigarette butt in Anna's car did not match any of the suspects, and it didn't match anybody in their criminal database. But those bloodstains found in Anna's car did match a suspect, the same one who did not have an alibi and who Anna wrote about. And so, based on this evidence, along with further investigation into this primary suspect, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Moses when she returned home from work on January 13th, 2015. Late that afternoon, Anna's killer crouched in a corner of her garage, clutching a .22 caliber rifle. He'd been able to slip inside a few minutes earlier because he knew the code to open the garage. Now he was waiting for Anna to get home. Just past 5:50 p.m., the killer heard the sound of the automatic garage door sliding open. Light began to fill the dark garage, and so as it did, he pressed his body back against the wall, trying to be as small and out of sight as possible. He watched as Anna pulled her car inside. The garage door shut, and the killer heard Anna's car door open and then close. Then he listened to her footsteps as she walked towards the door to her house. But before she could open it, the killer stood, raised his gun, and fired 3 shots into her back. Anna spun around in shock. She dropped her mail, purse, and the quesadilla she'd been carrying but not eating. Before she could say anything, the killer fired 3 more shots. 2 hit Anna in the chest, and the other hit her in the neck. Anna crumpled to the ground with blood flowing out of her mouth. Anna's killer slowly lowered his rifle and walked towards her. He watched her chest for any sign of movement, but it wasn't moving. She was not breathing. So he picked up her car keys off the floor and was about to get into her car when he saw the uneaten chicken quesadilla on the floor. So he picked it up, ate it right next to her body, and left the wrapper behind. The killer then got into Anna's car, opened up the garage door again, backed out, and shut the door as he drove away. But he didn't realize that he had a cut on his right hand, and it was leaking blood onto Anna's car seat and center console. The following evening, the killer abandoned the blue Hyundai in a neighborhood a few blocks away from Anna's home, and as law enforcement investigated Anna's murder, her killer did his best to appear very cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed, and he agreed to give a swab of his DNA. But at the same time the killer was kind of putting on this act, in the background, he was doing everything he could to profit off of Anna's death. And that's what police understood as soon as they read the translation of that Russian letter. It was a note that Anna had written to her lawyer in 2013 during her divorce from Bob, and she told her lawyer that Bob was now threatening to kill himself and frame Anna as his murderer just so her son, Igor, would hate her. When Detective Schutte read this, he realized Anna and Bob's divorce was not nearly as amicable as people thought. In fact, the couple had a long history of problems. In 2008, Anna visited a counselor after learning Bob had an affair. She wanted to leave him, but said she felt indebted to him because of how much he'd helped her during Igor's cancer battle. And years later, Anna had called one of her close friends crying, saying she had locked herself in a closet because she was afraid Bob was going to kill her. Anna hid these ugly realities about Bob from her son because she knew her son loved Bob. Bob was the only father figure Igor had ever known, and Anna didn't want to damage that relationship, even if it meant she had to act friendly towards a man she feared. But Bob was angry that Anna divorced him, and he was filled with jealousy over Anna's relationship with Michael. Adding to Bob's bitterness, Anna got total ownership of the large 2-story house they used to share. Bob claimed that at the time Anna was killed, he was at home watching TV, but his housemates told police they did not remember him being home at that time. And while none of Bob's guns matched the murder weapon, he was a military veteran with experience using guns. And so police believe Bob must have taken apart the murder weapon and hid or destroyed the pieces. And if police had any doubts that Bob was the killer, well, the DNA evidence totally erased those doubts. It was clearly Bob's blood inside of Anna's car, likely from a cut on Bob's right hand that he had bandaged by the time he met with police. On February 26, 2015, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mencken arrested Bob at Anna's home. Bob maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty at his trial. Bob's defense argued that there were too many unanswered questions in Anna's murder, like whose DNA was on the Red Bull can and the cigarette butt found in Anna's car. But the prosecution argued that Bob may have planted this evidence just to confuse investigators. In the end, a jury found Bob guilty of murder, and a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Bob would appeal his conviction in 2018, but an appeals court upheld the jury's original ruling, and to this day, Bob remains incarcerated.
In March of 2015, 22-year-old Sailor Gilliams and her good friend Brendan Vega, who was also 22, decided they wanted to go hiking. Now, they were both highly inexperienced hikers, so when they were looking in the area for places to go hiking, they were looking for novice trails, things that they would be able to manage. And they thought they had found one in Santa Barbara, California. And so they headed off in that direction and they took off on this particular trail. A little ways into their hike, and they started to feel like, man, the terrain here is pretty treacherous. This is way more difficult than we were expecting when we looked at the map. And as they continued and they're climbing over these huge boulders and it just seems totally like an advanced trail, they start to wonder, did we veer off the trail? Worried they might be lost, they turned around and began backtracking, hoping to find the trail and find some landmark that would allow them to confirm they were on the right trail. As they're backtracking, not only do they not find the trail, but they don't find any trail. They've managed to go completely off the path and are now in this kind of random boulder field that they have no idea where it is on the map. Navigating this terrain in the daytime with light would have been difficult even for an experienced hiker. But now it's nighttime, they don't have flashlights, and they're jumping boulder to boulder, and Sailor at some point loses her footing and falls and fractures her leg. Brendan rushes over and tries to help Sailor stand up, but she can't move. And so Brendan tries to put her on his shoulders and starts walking with her. And that works for a little while until they're passing by this waterfall and they fall off of it and they come careening down, they smash onto the ground, they survive the fall, but Brendan now has a broken elbow and Sailor now has a broken ankle on top of her broken leg. Sailor's in excruciating pain, and because of this fall, there's just no way Brendan's going to be able to lift her back up and keep walking. And so the decision was made that Brendan was going to go try to find help on his own, and that she would stay here and continue to yell for help in hopes that someone might hear her before Brendan got back. He takes off, and as soon as he's around the corner and gone, Sailor begins screaming for help, and she would continue screaming for help all through the night, well into the next day. About 24 hours after Brendan had left, he still had not returned, and at this point, Sailor's in and out of consciousness. She knows that she's going downhill quickly unless someone finds her. By the following afternoon, Brendan is still not back yet. So laying face down in the mud with flies buzzing all over her head, she was helpless and trapped, and there was nothing she could do but wait until either a miracle occurred and someone found her, or most likely she just dies. So at the same time that Sailor and Brendan are going through this horrible ordeal, three totally unconnected people decide they want to blow off work and school and just go escape into nature. And so they settle on a hike that would bring them to a waterfall in Santa Barbara, California. Even though this waterfall was a popular tourist attraction, it was very difficult to get to it. It basically required 45 minutes of almost uphill climbing across boulder fields. Very dangerous, and it's not something for a novice hiker to be doing. So they reach the parking lot, they take off on this hike, and when they're just at the base of the waterfall, instead of taking the main trail up to the top, the three hikers decide, let's actually go around off the trail to this pocket of boulders over here where there's a couple freshwater pools that have formed underneath the base of the waterfall. So they leave the main trail and they're climbing over these huge boulders. It's very dangerous. And at some point, one of the hikers starts taking pictures as they're kind of going across these boulders. Through the viewfinder, as they're taking pictures, they notice something out of the corner of their eye that's in frame. It was like this red flash of something. And so the hiker puts their camera down and she looks down where she sees this red, and she can tell right away that it's someone's hair. It's a girl's dyed red hair. And it was Sailor. The hikers went down to Sailor and they called 911, and they came in, they airlifted her out of there, and Sailor would actually make a full recovery. Unfortunately, Sailor's friend Brendan did not make it. They found his body about 100 meters away from where she had been laying. After the ordeal, the woman who was taking those pictures and had spotted Sailor out of the corner of her eye, she went to her camera and was flicking through some of the pictures she had taken during the hike. She had inadvertently taken a picture of Sailor before they had found her. So had it not been for these hikers being where they were and taking those pictures and noticing her red hair, this picture almost certainly would have become the last picture of Sailor Gilliams alive.
Our next story is called When You Find My Body.
"66-year-old Geraldine Largay was nicknamed Inchworm by her friends for her hilariously slow hiking pace. But her slow pace didn't stop her from doing the thing that she loved, which was to hike. And in fact, on April 23rd, 2013, Geraldine, along with one of her close friends, Jane Lee, decided to embark on this nearly 1,000-mile-long hike through the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine's husband of 42 years, his name was George, he planned to drive ahead of the pair and meet them at prearranged spots along this 1,000-mile-long journey to give them supplies, and would occasionally bring them to a motel so they could shower and sleep in a bed. By June 30th, so more than 2 months after they had started this journey, Jane finds out that she has a family emergency and she isn't able to continue this hike. Geraldine decided she was going to finish what she started on her own, despite the fact that realistically she hated hiking alone. She was very scared, frankly, of being out in the wilderness by herself, but she only had about 200 miles left, and so she figured, what the heck, I'll finish this thing out on my own. Later, Jane would tell investigators that when she left the trail to handle this family emergency, she felt like Geraldine was a little bit in over her head. She was someone that just didn't do well hiking on her own, and she still had 200 miles to go. But Jane just had too much going on in her life, and so she didn't stick around to try to convince Geraldine to come with her. Instead, she said, "Best of luck, Geraldine, and I'll see you at the end." So for the next 3 weeks, Geraldine carried on down the Appalachian Trail on her own. And by all accounts, it was going really well. She was checking in with her family and saying, "This is the mile mark I'm at," and she was making all her rendezvous points with George to get resupplied and to go to the motel with him. And so everything was going great. Then on July 22nd, Geraldine would send a text message to her husband George saying that she thinks she's in some trouble and that she lost the trail and is now lost. And she would ask him to call the Appalachian Mountain Club and see if they had a trail maintainer that could come out and look for her and kind of get her back on track. The problem was Geraldine couldn't get these text messages to go through. There was very bad service where she was. So she begins to walk to higher ground to try to get a better cell phone signal. And so she goes up this hill and she repeatedly tries to send these text messages out to George to say, "I'm lost and I need help," but none of them were going through. She would spend the whole night trying to send text messages from this mountain before finally putting her sleeping bag down and sleeping for the night. The next morning she got up and she sent another text message, this one a little bit more urgent, to her husband. She told him that she was lost since yesterday and was off the trail 3 or even 4 miles and that he should now call the police. But that message also failed, and so none of her messages over the past 24 hours have been sent out, and so nobody knows that she's lost. But at some point that day, she decides, I'm going to just put my phone away, save the battery life, and just wait, because I'm supposed to meet my husband today, and when I don't show up, he's going to call authorities, they're going to come looking for me, and everything will be fine. She leaves the mountain and finds this area underneath a couple of trees that had some pine needles on the ground. It was relatively soft. She set up her tent underneath these trees. She hangs a silver reflective blanket up over one of the trees to try to signal to helicopters or anybody flying overhead. She even began burning some bark to create a smoke signal, and she proceeded to wait. And sure enough, later that day, George, who's waiting at the rendezvous point for his wife, she doesn't show up, and he immediately contacts the authorities, who launch a huge search to go find Geraldine. Tragically, Geraldine was actually only about a mile, maybe 2 miles off of the trail. So she was not far from where she needed to be, but because it was so densely forested, she had no way of knowing that, and sound didn't travel very well. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, as this huge search with helicopters and planes and people on horseback and hunters and all these people in the area, they didn't find her. They might have come very close to her without knowing it, but again, because it was so densely forested, they never linked up. So on August 4th, about 2 weeks into this big search, they end up scaling it back and say, sorry, but we can't find her. The whole time this is going on, Geraldine stays at her campsite. She doesn't go anywhere. She figures this is my best chance to survive. And she's staying very positive. She has this journal that every day she would write inside of it a daily observation, and she would also write letters to her family. All of these messages were incredibly positive. She was very much expecting to be rescued and would have this great story to tell. But as days went on and no one was finding her, you could tell in her writing that she had come to terms with the reality that she was not going to make it out of here alive. And so before she died, she wrote this beautiful message to her husband and to her daughter. When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me. No matter how many years from now, please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them. 2 years later, a forester would be in the area and would come across Geraldine's tent that was now crumpled and collapsed. And inside, he would find Geraldine inside of her sleeping bag with the journal over her chest. And inside the tent, she'd kept it neat and clean all the way to the very end. This is someone that went out with absolute grace. Back on July 22nd, 2013, the day Geraldine would go missing, she woke up and she was all smiles and motivated to start the day. She heads off down the Appalachian Trail at about 6:30 in the morning, and she passes by another hiker who stops Geraldine. And apparently this hiker saw Geraldine's smile and said it was so infectious that she had to take a picture of her. And so Geraldine laughed and posed for that picture. After the picture was taken, the women laughed about it and then went their separate ways. And then by 11 a.m. that morning, Geraldine was lost.
The next and final story of today's episode is called SOS.
Japan is comprised of 4 major islands. The northernmost island is called Hokkaido. And on Hokkaido, there is this beautiful national park called Daisetsuzan that is nicknamed the Playground of the Gods, because the park is basically all these huge mountains that stretch up into the clouds. The tallest mountain inside of this park is Mount Asa Hidake, which reaches an elevation over 7,500 feet, and it is a very popular hiking destination. The trail that brings you to the summit of Mount Asa Hidake is considered relatively straightforward. It's pretty much just a straight line. But there is one very tricky spot. On the way up, as you get closer and closer to the summit, the trees begin to disappear and you're left with this kind of open landscape where the trail becomes fairly ambiguous. It's hard to know where you're going. And so hikers are instructed to look for a landmark, which is this big square boulder that's known as Safe Rock. And once you get to Safe Rock, apparently the rest of the trail is easy to identify and follow all the way up to the summit. There's a catch though. In the same area as Safe Rock is another large square boulder that looks exactly like Safe Rock. And this imposter is called False Safe Rock. If a hiker confuses False Safe Rock for the real thing and then attempts to take the path leading away from the imposter, they will be led down a path that many people have gotten lost on. At first, it will feel like you are making progress towards the summit of the mountain, but eventually the trail begins to gradually go downhill. Now, you would think that would be a fairly obvious red flag if the trail is going down and you're trying to go up to the summit, that probably something's gone wrong here, you've taken a wrong turn, but put yourself in the mind of someone who's made this mistake. In their mind, they reached the landmark of Safe Rock, although it was the imposter, False Safe Rock, and so they think they're on the right path. And if this is their first time being on this mountain, which a lot of people it is, they'd probably convince themselves that they've gone the right way and just keep on going. And so if you just keep on going and you don't recognize this mistake, about a mile away from False Safe Rock, you enter into this valley that's completely overgrown with thick bamboo. It's very swampy, and there's lots of very steep cliff drop-offs. And once you go inside of this area, you can't see anything because the bamboo is so tall and so thick, and so it's very easy to get turned around, and it's pretty easy to accidentally walk off of a cliff. And so over the years, hikers who have accidentally taken the trail leading away from false safe rock have gotten lost in this treacherous area, and not all of them have come back. In July of 1989, two men from Tokyo were hiking up the trail towards the summit of Mount Asadake when they reached what they believed was safe rock. However, it was not. It was false safe rock. And so when they followed the trail leading away from false safe rock, it was not long before they were lost in that valley overgrown with bamboo. That night, when these two men did not come home, their friends and family called the police, and a search was launched for them. Over the first couple of days, there was no luck. They could not find these two guys. They had no idea where they had gone. They looked all over this swampy area, thinking that's where they might be, but they couldn't find them. But then on July 24th, a helicopter was flying over the mountain over an area that had not really been thoroughly searched. It was just to the east of that valley with all the bamboo where they expected them to be. And this helicopter pilot, as he went around a corner, he got a view down to the midsection of the mountain, and he saw this big, wide open clearing. And right in the middle of this clearing are three huge letters. They are spelled using birch logs, and the three letters are SOS. SOS is an international code used to signal extreme distress. People who go missing or who get stranded somewhere, they will try to spell the three letters, SOS, as big as they possibly can, and then they will camp out near their signal in hopes that someone will see it and then come and rescue them. This helicopter pilot that's seen this distress signal immediately flew over the letters expecting to look down and see the two missing hikers from Tokyo. But when he was hovering over the SOS and he's looking down, there was no one there, despite the fact that this was a wide open area. They are not in the bamboo valley anymore. But either way, he signaled to the rest of the search party that he had found their SOS signal, and before long, more helicopters and search teams were brought over to that area. And then several hours later, a search team that was on the ground, who was walking about 2 miles north of this SOS signal, saw these two very haggard-looking guys come out of the bamboo brush, and they come walking up towards them, and it turns out it was the missing men from Tokyo. They were very ragged, they were dehydrated and famished, and they were kind of on the brink of death, but they were alive, and they were extremely happy to have been found. And so a helicopter was brought in, the two men were flown out to the nearest hospital, and then after receiving medical care, it was determined they would both make full recoveries. Excited by this news, the pilot and some of the other rescuers went to the men's hospital room to pay them a visit. And over the course of their conversation, the pilot brings up to the two men that they were really smart to build that SOS signal, that in fact, had they not built the SOS, it's unlikely anyone would have found them. And as soon as the two men heard this, they kind of reacted to it, they looked at each other, and they looked at the pilot and they said, "What SOS signal? We didn't make an SOS signal." After asking the men several questions to make sure they really didn't make this signal, the pilot and the rest of the searchers said, we have to go back to the mountain. We have to go back to the SOS signal because somebody else has made it and they need our help. And so early the next morning, the searchers went back out to the mountain, back to the SOS signal to scour the area all over again. And shortly after they began this search, one of the searchers found this deep hole underneath the roots of a tree. And in this hole was a backpack. And in this backpack, amongst other things, was a driver's license and an audio recorder. The license belonged to a 25-year-old Japanese man named Kenji Iwamura, who 5 years earlier had been staying at a lodge near the mountain, and one day he had left, and on his way out, he had told the owner of this lodge that he was going for a hike to the summit of Mount Asadake. A couple of days later, when Kenji was supposed to check out of the lodge, he didn't, and so the owner went to his room, he knocked, but there was no answer, and so the owner used his master key, he opened the door, and when he looked inside, there was no Kenji, but all of his belongings were still there. And so the owner thought that was odd because the last time he saw him, he was going out for this hike, and so he put two and two together and thought, you know what, I think this guy's in trouble, so he called the police and reported him missing. A search is launched for Kenji, but Kenji was never found, and so there was always this mystery about what happened to him. Fast forward back to 1989, and these searchers are looking at this backpack, they've just looked at this license, and then one of the searchers reaches in and pulls out the audio recorder and hits the play button. What they heard was very disturbing. It was the sound of a young man, presumably, who was very distressed, who was calling out for help. And it's believed this young man is Kenji. In Japanese, he very slowly and deliberately says, "I'm stuck on a cliff, I can't move, SOS, please help me. I'm at the spot where I first saw the helicopter, but the bamboo is too thick, I can't move, please lift me up out of here, SOS." Here is a clip of the actual recording. At this point, it seemed fairly obvious to police that based on the proximity of the backpack to the SOS letters, and the fact that the recording, which was in the backpack, had Kenji literally saying SOS. He says this on the recording, that Kenji must have been the one who built this SOS sign. He must have built it back in 1984 when he got lost. And so now that the police believed they had solved the mystery of who built the SOS sign, they now needed to figure out where this person went. Where was Kenji? And so over the next several hours, searchers continued to look around the immediate area of where this backpack was found, and soon they would discover something that, according to police, solved this 5-year-old mystery. They figured out what happened to Kenji. Now, there is no official police narrative, at least not online, that explains step by step what happened to Kenji. So what I'm about to share with you is what I was able to deduce from all of the official reporting that I could find online. In 1984, Kenji left his lodge and headed for the summit of Mount Asahidake, and on the way up, he most likely mistook the false safe rock for the safe rock, and just like the two men from Tokyo would do 5 years later, Kenji went down the wrong path and got lost in that valley covered in bamboo. At some point, Kenji stopped trying to find his way back to the trail and instead tried to just go down the mountain any way he could. And so as he's making his way through this very thick vegetation and this bamboo, he eventually gets to a point where he lowers himself down over this ledge and he lands on this cliff. And as soon as he lands, he looks over the edge and he realizes he can't go any farther. It's too steep, it's too dangerous. But when he turns around to try to climb back up, it's also too steep. So he was trapped on this ledge. And so there, on this cliff ledge, he sits and waits, hoping that someone has reported him missing and they will come and find him before he dies. And at some point, as he's sitting there waiting, a helicopter flies overhead. And Kenji most likely was elated. He probably believed they saw him and he thought he was going to get rescued, but the helicopter would eventually just fly away, giving no indication of whether they had actually seen Kenji. And so for what must have been at least a couple of days, Kenji sat on this ledge expecting this helicopter to come back, but over time he gradually came to the conclusion that that helicopter had probably not seen him and they were not coming back. There was no rescue party inbound for him. And so it was around that time, as he's having this horrible realization, that he pulls out that audio recorder and he records that very eerie and distressing message where he's calling out for help and saying that he's stuck on this ledge. And then after he was done, at some point, Kenji came to the conclusion that his best chance at survival was not waiting for some helicopter to potentially come back, because at this point that seemed really unlikely. Instead, his best chance and perhaps only chance was to try to climb down this cliff right in front of him that he had already determined was way too dangerous. And so Kenji lowered himself and began climbing down this cliff, and miraculously, he got all the way to the bottom where the ground leveled off without serious injury. And so from that point, he just kept on walking down the mountain, trudging through all this bamboo, until he actually leaves the bamboo and enters this huge clearing on the side of the mountain, where basically it's devoid of any vegetation besides some birch trees off in the distance. And it was in this clearing that Kenji would construct that SOS signal, believing that was his ticket out of there. But unfortunately, it was not. 5 years later, after searchers had just located Kenji's backpack underneath the roots of that tree, they would go on to make that huge discovery that solved the 5-year mystery. And that discovery was a partial human skeleton laying nearby. And eventually, that skeleton would be determined to be Kenji's. And at this point, the police said they were not suspecting foul play in Kenji's death. However, they did not release his exact cause of death. It's unclear if they just could not determine it or if they didn't want to release it publicly, but either way, we don't know what it is. And then after that, the police just closed the case and said, okay, we're done. But to the people who had been closely following this story, because this was a big deal at the time in 1989, they thought the police were kind of missing something. There was this obvious, huge discrepancy that they all figured the police were going to address at some point, and now it seemed like they weren't. And a lot of people felt like this is not a discrepancy you can just sweep under the rug. This is a really big deal. And that discrepancy was, how could Kenji have made that SOS signal? As a reminder, the 3 letters SOS that was found in that clearing, they were made with 19 birch tree logs. Each letter was 16 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And each log, each birch tree log that made these letters up, they were all about the same length and appeared to have been expertly cut, indicating they had been chopped with an axe or some other cutting tool. And where this SOS was actually located in that clearing, it was several hundred feet away from the other birch trees. So on top of the enormous effort that would go into cutting down 19 trees with an axe, and I can assure you that cutting down a tree with an axe or a hatchet is way harder than you think it is, Kenji would have also had to expend a lot of additional energy just dragging the felled logs over to the area where he actually built the signal. Basically, this was a gargantuan task that even for someone who was fit and healthy and strong in the best of conditions, they would still struggle with this. And so the idea that Kenji, after being missing in the wild for several days, he's probably dehydrated, he's famished, he's tired, he's sore, he's scared, he's in the worst possible shape you can be in, the idea that he pulled this off is kind of unbelievable. And in fact, the person who did Kenji's autopsy would say that Kenji was not physically capable of putting together that SOS signal. He was just too weak. And there's another complication to factor in. There was no axe or any other cutting tool found anywhere near the SOS signal, near the skeleton, near the backpack, nowhere. There was no cutting tool. So either Kenji did have an axe and somehow mustered the superhuman strength necessary to chop down 19 trees and then he built this SOS signal, in which case, why didn't the authorities find the axe? Or Kenji did not have an axe, in which case, why were there 19 perfectly cut birch logs just laying around in an area that virtually no one went intentionally? When the police just would not answer these simple questions about the axe, people began coming up with their own theories as to what happened. The most prominent theory was that Kenji was not actually alone. This would explain how he went about building that SOS signal. He had help. And it would also explain why Kenji's family, when they heard that audio recording for the first time, they said, that doesn't sound like our son. And so according to this additional person theory, that recording wasn't of Kenji. It was of this other person, this additional person. People who subscribe to this theory also point out that originally the skeleton was not classified as belonging to Kenji. It was classified as belonging to some unknown female with type O blood. The media and the public went crazy at this revelation, and very quickly the police were being hit with lots of questions about this development, which they had no idea what to say about it. And so they looked kind of bad in the media, they didn't have very many answers, they didn't have any leads, the pressure was building, and then all of a sudden the police say, oh, we looked at the bones again, and it turns out they were not type O blood female, they were actually type A blood male, which conveniently is the same sex and blood type as Kenji. Some say this was a pure fabrication by police to very conveniently tie up all the loose ends of a case they were doing a very bad job solving, that in reality, those were not Kenji's bones. Kenji's still somewhere out there, we haven't found him yet, and those bones belong to some unknown female with type O blood, and she was the additional person. But the reality is, even if this additional person theory is plausible, it's highly unlikely it will ever be looked at seriously by authorities because at this point, the case is considered closed. So as of now, the only thing we can all say with certainty is that an SOS sign on the side of this mountain saved the lives of 2 men from Tokyo in 1989. But exactly who the sign builder or builders were, and then what happened to them, still remains a mystery for many people.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please cut all the Waldos out of a Where's Waldo book and then give that to the Amazon Music follow button for their birthday. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen